Hello, YouTube. So, a few years ago, I did a video series on the philosophy of sex. One of the things I didn't cover in that series was the question of what are the conditions for ethical kink or ethical BDSM. Um, and this is quite an interesting question because if you look at the kink or BDSM communities, people there have explicitly articulated certain views about what conditions are required in order for kink activities to be ethical. They have proposed their very own conceptual analyses, I suppose, of ethical kink. So I thought I would talk a little bit about that in this video. So the standard view is what's known as safe, sane, and consensual, and I suppose that's kind of self-explanatory, right? In order for kink activities to be ethical, they have to meet these three conditions. They have to be safe, right? So you're not putting yourself or others at any risk of injury, of harm. Make sure you're using protection. Make sure you know what you're doing with any of the items that you might be using, etc. They have to be sane, and sanity is, as I understand it, usually understood in terms of sort of self-control. That's a big part of it, at least, is that you have to kind of know what your own limits are, and you have to be clear about that, and you have to make sure that you are able to act within your own limits. It's you. It's you. It often, I mean, it's kind of vague, right? What exactly do we mean by sanity? But make sure that all aspects of what you're doing are well understood. Don't be, using this as a kind of therapy for trauma or anything like that. That sort of thing. And then finally, it has to be consensual, which is pretty obvious. Everybody has to be agreeing to what they're doing. So yeah, safe, sane, and consensual. So there are some problems with this. I mean, it's certainly intuitive, but I think that the most obvious concern is with the sanity condition. So the sanity condition is somewhat unclear. Again, I've heard this defined in different ways, or elaborated in different ways. So there's a problem of, well, what exactly do we mean when we're classifying certain behaviours as sane or insane? Obviously, there's a long history of perfectly acceptable sexual behaviour being classified as insane. Go back 100 years, and pretty much all of the things people get up to in the BDSM community would probably count as violating the sanity condition. And there's also a question about, okay, well, why would this matter as an independent condition if we are supposing that some activity is both safe and consensual? What difference does sanity make? Um, I mean, so obviously it's important to emphasize things like self-control, and it's also important that everybody is capable of, everybody involved in the activity is capable of reasoning well, and they understand what they're doing. But that seems to just be part of, that just seems to be kind of an aspect of the safety and consent conditions, right? So if somebody is genuinely mentally ill, and they're not capable of reasoning, they don't really understand what's going on, well, obviously that's going to violate consent. Or if somebody does not have appropriate self-control, that's going to violate the safety condition. So it seems like, insofar as sanity it seems like, insofar as that's important, right? It's just an aspect of these other conditions. Um, and so yeah, I mean, it's like, well, as long as it's safe, as long as it's consensual, why would it matter? And I think there's kind of a danger in sort of putting too much emphasis on sanity, because it may be the case that people's sexual interests are like expressions of mental illness or past trauma or whatever, and it's not really clear why that would necessarily be a problem. I mean, in fact, that could be the case even for relatively mild kinks, right? It might be that somebody develops an interest in like slapping or bondage, right? And that's relatively mild sort of stuff, right? Maybe that was provoked by physical trauma when they were younger. Maybe they'd been physically abused, and then that, the way that they worked through that was, or it like manifested itself later in an interest in these activities. Well, I mean, obviously it's bad that that happened in their past, but why would it be a problem if they're now gaining pleasure from these activities as an adult? If that allows them a sort of sense of control over it or whatever. I mean, who knows? The psychology of these things is very complicated, right? But it does seem to be the case that very often people's sexual interests can be influenced by bad experiences in the past or by mental illnesses. That doesn't seem to be a problem in itself, as long as it's as long as it's safe and it's all under control now. So there are problems with the sanity condition. There's also problems, I think, with the safety condition for a couple of reasons. So the first point is that I'm not sure why safety is like a moral requirement. There are lots of dangerous activities that are perfectly acceptable provided people consent to them. For instance, mountaineering. Plenty of people have been injured or killed in the course of climbing mountains. And if you like, if you want to climb Annapurna, I think Annapurna is the most dangerous mountain, at least the most dangerous one to try to summit. Yeah, that's probably a lot riskier than the most BDSM activities, even most extreme BDSM activities. Like there's plenty of things that we do where we are taking risks, and that doesn't seem to be a problem as long as everybody understands what it is that they're doing. Now, of course, it is worth pointing out that so first of all, right, there are laws that we have to bear in mind here. If you end up doing some sort of BDSM scene and you end up killing somebody, the law is going to have something to say about that. So it makes sense that you might emphasize safety for that reason. But I'm not talking about the law here. I'm just talking about what we would sort of see as being the kind of ethical or moral restrictions. And I don't think there's anything morally wrong with people taking risks, with people doing things that are unsafe. And I suppose actually, the violating the law breaking the law is itself, right, one risk among many that it's, in my opinion, okay for people to do. So yeah. So that's one point. Another point, of course, is that a lot of these activities are not just taking place in private. People have like public kink parties. So it might make sense that if you're running a party, you would impose an extra condition that tries to minimize risk. If there's a whole group of people, like, well, you don't want people taking risks very often. So we sort of set a safety standard. But my own view is that standard should be determined freely by the people involved. So yeah, this is one point, right? Safety, at least in my view, I don't see this as a moral requirement. I think that I think it's fine for people to take risks. The second problem, though, is maybe a bit more serious, which is that I think that there's a danger that the safety standard can be misleading. Because, of course, even normal sex is not perfectly safe, right? Even if you're just having normal sex, there's a whole bunch of risks there. There's risks of pregnancy, there's risks of STDs, there's maybe risks of forming emotional attachments that you maybe don't want to form, right? There's all sorts of things going on there, even in normal sex. And I mean, so there's certainly going to be risks in many kink activities. I guess maybe even all of them. Like, even if you're just doing relatively sort of normal bondage, there's a risk of tying the ropes too tight, and that can cut off circulation, and that might cause problems. If you're doing stuff like suspension bondage, which is a bit more extreme, where people are like actually hung up on ropes, well, if something goes wrong, they could fall, and if they're tied up, they're not going to be able to put their arms out to break their fall. You could get really seriously injured doing something like that. And with all of these things, there are things that you can do to mitigate the risk, but you're never going to remove the risk entirely. The question is a matter of how much risk a person wants to take. But to sort of say, well, the standard here is that activities must be safe, sane, and consensual. And if you say that, right, and then you say, well, here are the activities that you can engage in, there is, I think, a danger of kind of actively misleading people about what what they're getting into, because you can never be perfectly safe. So the question is, how much risk is involved? What are the risks? And what sort of risk are you willing to take on? So because of reasons like this, there's an alternative view which has been developed within the kink community, known as risk-aware consensual kink. So again, this I suppose is fairly self-explanatory. Kink activities do not have to be, safe. In fact, the very idea of safety is problematic for the reason I pointed out. They don't have to be sane, right? Instead, right, they have to be consensual, and people have to be aware of what the risks are. You have to take some time to think about what it is you're doing and to think about what might go wrong, etc. So I tend to think that this is a more useful way of framing the issue. But I actually, I would actually say that risk awareness is really just part of what's required in order to consent. So, I think that really what's going on, right, is that what actually matters is consent, and that's it, right? And then risk awareness is just part of that. So, because in order to consent to an activity, I need to know what that activity is, and it seems like I need to know the risks. If I don't know what the risks are, if I don't have any idea of what might happen as a result of my doing the activity, that does seem to undermine consent. I mean, if you think about, for instance, think about the question, a lot of us assume that intoxication can undermine consent. If somebody's really drunk, then that undermines their ability to consent to some activities. And why would that be? Well, it looks like a plausible answer to that is that when you're intoxicated, you become less able to evaluate the risks and benefits of various activities, right? That seems to be the issue. But if you're really drunk, your cognitive capacities are reduced. You become a lot more impulsive than you would otherwise be. You don't think things through. So you're not properly evaluating the risks and benefits. So it seems to me that risk awareness, right? It's not like you have consent and then you have risk aware consent. Risk awareness is just part of consent. And so my own view on this is that what's required for ethical kink is just consent, right? It's actually basically the same as what's required for sex in general. So yeah, that was a bit of a reflection on the question of what constitutes ethical kink. It is worth pointing out actually that what I've my approach to this is maybe missing the point a little bit. So what I would say is, if you ask what are the conditions for ethical kink, I would say consent, right? I think it's just consent, and insofar as sanity and risk awareness and so on, insofar as they matter, well, they're just part of consent. So what matters is consent. But then there's an additional question of, well, how do we promote that? How do we ensure as a community that everybody who's engaging in these activities is consenting? So it's one thing to engage in a kind of philosophical analysis of particular proposals, and it's another thing to use these proposals as slogans. And I think that the utility of slogans like safe, sane, and consensual, or risk aware, consensual kink, is of course to draw attention to important aspects of consent. You know, I mean, kink is kind of different from normal sex insofar as I think that in like a lot of normal sexual situations, consent is often kind of implied. It's not like people, you don't. Well, I don't know whether this is the case usually, but very often, people will engage in sex just, it just sort of happens, right? You don't say, do you want to do this? And then the other person like verbally says yes. It's not like you have a list of things where it's like, okay, do you want to do this? Do you want to do this? Do you want to, yes, no, yes, yes. That's not how it usually works, or that's not how it often works, right? Very often people who are attracted to each other and they're in a sexual situation will just kind of do it, and the consent is sort of implied. And with a lot of normal activities, that's okay because we can rely on, there's an assumption of like background knowledge. Like we know that like I will know if I'm about to have sex with somebody, I will know that they are aware of pregnancy, of STDs, of risks like that. You can just kind of, that's just an assumption. That's just like background knowledge that everybody in our culture has. Well, I mean, as like every normal adult human, right? In our culture is just going to have that as background knowledge. But of course, it's different with kink. When it comes to like these are activities that people might not have thought through, right? What the risks are. They might not have thought through what exactly these activities are going to be like, and they're not just they're not just like part of the normal course of things in sex. Like tying somebody up with ropes is not just something you just do. So yeah, it seems like, given that this is the case, it might be worth using these slogans to draw attention to important things that we have to like make sure everybody is aware of. So we say risk aware, consensual kink. Draw attention to the fact that you have to think through the risks. And again, as I mentioned earlier, right, like it also makes sense for particular organizations or groups of people to have stricter norms, because BDSM and kink is very often not completely private. There's public parties. So something like, I don't know, blood play, well, maybe that's fine for partners in private, but in a public setting it's going to be more problematic. So yeah, I mean, being a philosopher within the sort of analytic tradition, I'm presented with a slogan like safe, sane, and consensual, and I like to think through it in a certain kind of way, which is what I've done here. But that might be missing the point of what the slogan is. It has some practical utility, even if it's not, philosophically watertight. Okay then. So well, those were some thoughts on ethical kink.